Name's Alexa LaPera. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the assistant curator, domestic environments and social diversity at Ingenium. I have short, curly brown hair with a light brown skin tone, and I'm wearing glasses today. As the convener for this year's Shannon Lecture Series, I really want to welcome you all to this series on the theme of Black histories and futures of science and technology. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that the work that I do is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. I also think it's important to reflect on how the histories of settler colonialism and slavery and its afterlives are really intertwined and continue to have systematic legacies that affect present day life on this land we now call Canada. This year's edition of the lecture series is brought in partnership with Ingenium, Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation. It was an amazing opportunity to help organize this lecture series and bring together what I think is a truly incredible slate of amazing speakers from across various Canadian institutions and disciplines. This year's series aims to offer a critical insight into how anti-Black racism's relationship with technology, but also how enables and enabled Black resistance, community building, and liberation. The speakers for the series understand technology in broad terms, ranging from the physical tools and scientific instruments to methodological practice and critical intervention. So these lectures suggest not only the ways of exploring Black histories and presence, but also ways for thinking about this fluid relationship that exists between technology and society. Today's presentation will feature the two inaugural fellows from the Ingenium's Black and African Canadian and Scientific and Technological Innovations Fellowship. Our fellowship encourages students to think broadly and creatively about historical and contemporary connections between Black Canadians in science and innovation. Our research institute gives us the capacity to support student research with our vast collection of artifacts and archival materials. And we will be opening the second year of applications for this fellowship in the new year, which is very exciting. So if you have any questions about the fellowship, you can reach out to me directly. And the fellowship was made possible by our founding donors, Dr. Gervin Fearon and Dr. Kathy Moscow, with support from the Ingenium Foundation. And I would like to thank our partners for the fellowship, the Black Canadian Studies Association. And finally, our wonderful fellows, Samia Dumais and Mila Mendez, for their time and commitment in helping us open this year's lecture series. Our presenters spent 4 months working with Ingenium's curatorial team, using our archival and artifact collection to explore histories of Black labor, agriculture, and life. And the format, finally, for today's presentations will include two 30-minute presentations and a 10-minute Q&A at the end of each presentation. We will aim to finish around 8:30, and I encourage you all to use the chat and leave comments and questions, as those will be monitored for the Q&A. But now I'll hand things over to Dr. Dominic Marshall from Department of History at Carleton University, who is also the chair for the Shannon Endowment Fund.
Thank you, Alexa. Thank you all for being there tonight and during our reading week at Carleton. For those of you who are from Carleton, I'm speaking from the same land as Alexa with the same thanks, and I have curly white hair and glasses. Just a word to thank the donor who made that series possible, Lois Long. Her life is described there on the website of the series, who gave a donation in the honor of her parents almost 3 decades ago. And she was friend with one of our retired colleague, Bruce Elliott, and together they put together this series on Canadian and social history, which is annual, and the rest of the fund helps us fund travel for graduate students and also scholarship for graduate students. We also would like to thank the Office of the Department of History, who has helped put the publicity together and organize the next 3 iterations of this, which will be at Dominion Chalmers. If you have any technical problem tonight, please write to Mackenzie, who is from Carleton Media Services and is taking care of the technical problems. And finally, if you are in attendance here and stay to the very end, you will be eligible to our draw. We have one draw for every lecture of Family Pass for a year at Ingenium, the 3 museums of Ingenium, which means 2 adults and any child or grandchild you want to bring under 17 years old at one of the 3 museums or the 3 museums. And we'll do the draw just before we leave at 8:30, and we'll use all your emails to do so. And up to you, Alexa.
I'll now take the time to introduce our final speaker for the night, Samia Dumais. Samia is a doctoral student in history at Concordia University. Her research focuses on African Canadian history in the second half of the 20th century and on the contemporary experiences of Afro-descendant and immigrant communities within Quebec and the Canadian educational structures. A member of the editorial board at Histoire Engagée magazine, Samia Dumais has worked on a variety of research projects in Ontario, Quebec, and she is currently the archivist for the community organization Herrenbach. Samia, I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, great. Can you hear me properly? Like, I know everyone. Okay, amazing. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. So, okay, so hi everyone. My name is Samia. I use she, her pronouns. I live and work in Joljake, unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. I am wearing a brown shirt. I have brown glasses and glasses chain, and I have my hair up in a bun. So before starting, I really want to thank Ingenium, of course, for this absolutely amazing opportunity. Alexa, for your constant guidance, Emily, for all of the rich conversations that we had, and especially the Ingenium library staff for their very valuable help during my 2 visits. I also want to mention that I am sick. So if suddenly I stop mid-sentence, you know that I'm going to be coughing, and then we'll move on and it's going to be fine. All right, so I'm going to start. In her book, North of the Color Line, Migration and Black Resistance in Canada from 1870 to 19...
Apologies, Samia, I don't see your presentation on the screen.
Thank you for flagging that. Can you see it now?
Perfect.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to start again. So in her book, North of the Color Line, Migration and Black Resistance in Canada from 1870 to 1955, historian Sage Mathieu argues that the rails became sites of racialized conflicts that are heavily influenced by essentializing representations of Black workers. When I was browsing Ingenium collections, I was really curious to see if there were any objects, documents, or photographs that were testifying to such a statement. And to my surprise, there was little to no representation of Black workers other than Black porters that were happily assisting white customers in what seems to be staged interactions. So these pictures really confirm another argument that Mathieu made in our monograph, which is that Canadian railway companies used racialized images of Black men to attract white passengers on Canadian lines. So when I initially started my research with Ingenium, I had a previous understanding of the experiences of porter just because of my previous, research or classes that I took during my academic career. And what I was seeing in Ingenium archives, in the CN collection and in some periodicals was not fitting with the previous knowledge that I had about Black porters. So I thought that this was a really interesting thing to think about, right? So what is highlighted in the archives versus what we know, not in an official way. So for this presentation, really what I want to do is take you all in a journey where you will see how the archives from the railway industries are portraying the porters, but more largely Black people. So these documents that I will be sharing from Ingenium are really telling one side of the story, but with oral histories, documentaries, and monographs, I can show you another stories. So passive depiction of Black workers really coexist alongside multiple articles in the archives that are highlighting the community involvement and the successes of Black porters outside of their jobs. However, in the periodical I consulted, there were no articles that highlighted the mobilization of the porters within their unions and all the struggles that happened where they fought for better work opportunities, but also for a better experience and better rights in the Canadian society. So ultimately, the periodicals and the images really produced a specific image and identity of porters. I will also share some reflections of two themes that I have been able to identify during my research, which are the exoticization of Black Caribbean communities and the very vague but still present representations of Black women within the railroad industry. So unfortunately, due to the constraint of time, I wasn't able to really dive as much as I would like to in these thematics. But I do think it's important to highlight them just to show the potential of 4 months of research at Ingenium. I also want to issue a trigger warning regarding one of the archives that I will be presenting during my talk. I consulted, like I mentioned, many articles from periodicals, and a lot of them were depicting, racist and stereotypical representations of Black people. I have been researching Black communities in Canada for a little bit more than 4 years now, and nothing really prepares us color when we stumble upon these representations. I still decided to share that article here, not to put the focus on the representation, but really to expose, the hypocrisy of the CPR, so the Canadian Pacific Railway, and the CNR, the Canadian National Railway, towards their employees. So before starting, a quick word on my methodology and the source that I will be using for this presentation. So first, I use the CN Images of Canada collections that consist of more than 100,000 photographs that are recording the development of the Canadian National as it operated freight and passenger trains. There was also a lot of pictures about hotels and resorts, ferry services, ocean steamships, and telecommunications as well. So the images, they had a direct commercial purpose to promote or to sell a travel product. I also picked two periodicals that were affiliated or linked to the two major Canadian railway companies of the 20th century. So I first consulted the Canadian National Railways magazine from 1919 to 1957, and I consulted the Spanner, which is the Canadian Pacific Railway magazine, from 1951 to 1971. So there are multiple scholars, such as Scott Rutherford or Amanda Ritchie, that argued that newspaper can be used to demonstrate the circulation of various ideas within minority communities all around Canada. I decided to apply a similar interpretation to the CPR and the CNR newspaper, assuming that the articles are reflecting the general mindset of the railway companies toward the porters, the workers, and more largely Black communities. However, using both the periodicals it's not enough to articulate kind of like the counter narrative that I'm seeking to do, to include the perspectives of Black porters and workers on the rails. So to do so, it is necessary to seek out testimonies that will center the voice of Black porters, workers, but also the voice of people that were navigating around porters. So as a student, affiliate, and a scholar in residence of the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling Codes at Concordia University, I use some of the archives for my research. So Codes was founded in 2006 by Dr. Stephen High, and their mission is, and I quote, to support the gathering and preservation of audio-visual oral history record while encouraging solo, collaborative, and community-based research, end of quote. So I browsed the collection Urban History Laboratory, Union United Church, that was realized in 2017. And I was able to identify many quotes from multiple people, either porters or people that were, like I said, evolving around porters. And these interviews are very important because they really demonstrate that porters are pillars for their communities, their organization, and their families. So these interviews, however, are really centering Montreal and Ontario. So to go broader and to really kind of like have a large portrait of Canada, I also consulted a documentary, The Road Taken, realized by Sel and Jacob in 1996. So this documentary really focused on the experiences of Black porters from Halifax and Winnipeg through multiple interviews and original archival material. And I also used an autobiography titled My Name's Not George, the story of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in Canada, narrated by Stanley G. Grizzle. So Grizzle, he's a porter himself. He eventually got appointed as a citizenship judge. And it's really his personal memoir of a lot of the struggles that happened within the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I also used multiple monographs about Black porters to really have a total, I would say, experience, or I would say like a total representation of what they were going through during the 20th century, especially in terms of their mobilizations within their unions. So I used North of the Color Line by Sage Mathieu. I also used They Call Me George, The Untold Story of Black Porters and the Birth of Modern Canada by Cecil Foster. And these two books are really interesting because they not only highlighted the experiences of Black porters in the workplace, but they also showed how Black porters act as citizens within the Canadian society and fought for better life conditions. And I also use two monographs by Dorothy Williams, so Black in Montreal's and then The Road to Now, to document the increase of Black communities in Montreal through various aspects of their lives. And considering that in the beginning of the 20th century, most Black men were working on the railroad industries, Dorothy Williams keeps track of the evolution of Black porters and Black workers with censuses, interviews, and community-based documents. So I'm going to start by a quote from the documentary The Road Taken. There was no other jobs available to them, Blacks. If you didn't work on the train, you hardly worked at all. And this statement is extremely powerful because it represents the reality of being a Black male worker in the beginning of the 20th century. So as you can see here, in the CN Images of Canada collection from Ingenium Canada, a lot of the porters were Black men. So when I was looking at CN when I was looking at this collection, sorry, there were not a lot of white porters. I think there were maybe like a dozen images of white porters, but it was really, really only Black porters. And this is not an hazard. So Canadian immigration policy did not encourage Black people to remain in Montreal or more specifically in Canada. So the Black population increased slowly between the beginning of the 20th century and let's say like the middle of the 20th century, even if there was really severe and rigid restrictions on immigration laws. And ultimately, this policy of discrimination really spilled over into the private industry. And this is something that Sage Mathieu documents in their book, that the pressure was really put on railroad companies to reduce Canada's attractiveness to Blacks in like tourist, travel, and homesteading advertisements. So now what is the meaning of this? Is that it was better for, I would say, the general imaginary of a Canadian, society to not have Black people visible in some cities. So a way to not have this visibility and to kind of like palliate the fact that the immigration was growing and growing was to hire Black people to work on either vessels or either on the trains so that they are always mobile. They don't really stay at one place. And it's also a way of containing them. So a day in the life of the porter, it's a tough job. So from polishing shoes to making beds and answering every passenger inquiry, the porters could work up to 21 hours a day, and they barely had time to rest. These poor conditions did really not seem to be a concern for the CPR or the CNR because it was only part of the job. And strangely enough, this is even something that is highlighted in one of the periodicals, the Canadian National Magazine. So as you can see here, from 1940, it's a picture of a porter. So his work all done for a short time, the sleeping car porter indulges in a spot of rest. This is very interesting because in the early volumes of the periodicals that I consulted, Black porters, like here, are rarely referred to with their first name when they are pictured performing duty or resting from duty. So the situation can really be identified as a form of depersonalization of Black porters through their lack of individual identification when they are on duty. This is a phenomenon that was documented by Stanley Grizzle as well as Cecil Foster. So indeed, Black porters were called George. All Black porters were called George by the customers after George Pullman, the inventor of the sleeping cars, so where the Black porters would work. Not only that, but the magazines would also feature a racist and stereotypical depiction of Black porters in cartoons. So there's a recurrent comic in the Canadian National Railway magazine that features a porter that's, he's kind of like a naive porter, and he goes by the name of George. I'm going to show you one example, and I'm issuing a trigger warning here. So that's George, and as you can see, even the way he's talking is kind of like questionable, if we could say like that, and it's from 1935. These are not, of course, only representation of a porter being depersonalized. Another example here is this picture of the porter for the amateur snapshot competition in 1939. So this porter is not referred to by his name. You only have, identification on his cap, on his shirt, but you don't know much more about this man other than the fact that he's a porter. Ultimately, the situation was fixed by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So a little bit about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It's originally led by African Americans, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, allowed Canadians to join their union in 1939. Of course, it was not like a total, let's all join and be together and we're going to fight for our rights. It was more complex than that at first. They were separated, and ultimately, Black porters were able to, fight for their complete autonomy, but also recognition within the union. And even if it was a large union in all of Canada, the provinces all had like their chapters, and the decisions that were taken in one province would not necessarily impact the other. So that being said, from 1939, Black porters in Canada had a union to help them navigate the many issues that they encountered on their job. And this situation, so the situation of depersonalization and being called George, was reported in Grizzle's monograph, where he says, and I quote, "Later, our brotherhood negotiated with the company to have each porter issued with 2 plastic name cards placed in wall holders at each end of the sleeping car to invite the customers to call us by our names," end of quote. So in this extract, there is no exact date of when the plastic name cards were put in place. I think it's around maybe like the 50s or the second half of the 1940s. It corresponds to a particular moment where there's more and more mobilization from the porters to fight for their rights, but also in Canadian society. But one of the reasons I also think it's around these times is because starting, I would say like 1940, 1945, there were more articles and periodicals that would refer porters to with their names. And this is interesting because even if they are referred to by their names, they're not pictured in their uniform, on the workplace. It's really a totally different way of addressing and thinking about the porters. So a first example is from 1958 here. So you don't see the porter, but you see his son. That won an oratorical award. And you have the name of the porter over here. So H.T. Ramsey, son of porter instructor. A little bit of information about the porter itself, but no sign of the porter. Another good example is that one. Porter's exhibit wins critical acclaim from 1951, where you have a picture of a porter that is in very good standing. It's mentioned over here, that won critical approval for his art in Toronto. And this tells us a lot about porters. So not only it tells us that they're not only porters, right? Like there's people and there's individuals behind the job. And this is something that Cecil Foster highlights in his book, that many of the porters had high education, they served in the 2 world wars, and they were aware of the latest cultural, musical, and fashion trends because they were traveling from one city to another. They were also extremely respected in their own communities because of their stable jobs. And this is something that I found in the interviews that I consulted. So an extract of the Urban History Laboratory coming from Florence Phillips. Believe it or not, the people who worked for Pullman Porter and the people that worked at the train got decent money. Yeah, they got good money. So they, from living in Burgundy, start moving to West Island, and they all have houses in the West Island, see? And they're driving from the West Island now. The West Island is building up because they had their own organizations and they have their own, but still a lot of them still come to this church because this is our church, see? From when we are small, you know? So yeah, end of quote. So for people who are not from Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, Burgundy used to be a very working class neighborhood, and then West Island is now considered one of the richest neighborhoods in Montreal. So there's still, you know, this recognition that even if the porters had this financial mobility, they would still, you know, gather in the places where they were born and where they grew up. Another example is from Wayne Thomas, and he mentions, and I quote, "When my father died in 1950, he had close to $3,000 saved up in the bank, having 7 children, and my mother didn't work. So to have that kind of money was like a lot of money for a family who had 7 children. He was going to move us to NDG and buy a home there or something like that. Would have made a big difference about my relationship to inaudible," end of quote. So NDG is also a neighborhood in Montreal. And you can see here that the financial stability that that came with being a porter is something that a lot of the people around them, you know, were looking upon. However, this financial stability was, even if it's a great thing, it also meant total stability in their jobs. And what I mean by that is that there were no possibilities of advancement for porters. So as you can see here in that quote, well, at that time, the employment of my father was a porter. At that time, the employment, you're a porter. That's it, you know. My brother is one of my brothers, also not a porter. At that, education was better. He became a conductor on the railroad, you know, end of quote. So this quote tells us that one of the brothers, you know, yes, became a conductor on the railroad, but this didn't happen overnight. Porters could not suddenly apply to become conductors and have the job. So one of the achievement, again, of the Brotherhood for Sleeping Car Porters, sorry, is enabling porters to apply for roles other than porters. And an example of how difficult it was for a porter to achieve another job can be found in the length of their time in their work as a porter. So, and this is universal. So first you have here an example. Sleeping car porter retires after 39 years in Spanner in 1951. Another example, Nelson Duncan, more than 41 years service with the company before retiring in 1966. And another example, Sam Goddard, that was watching out for the comfort of patrons for more than 36 years from the Canadian National Magazine. So this is really universal to both companies. And strangely enough, the top rank of a porter, so a porter in charge, had the same basic responsibilities as a sleeping car conductor, but they still couldn't apply for the position of a conductor. And the injustice rose to an eye when in 1954, a Black porter applied for the position of sleeping car conductor after learning that the Canadian Pacific Railway hired 10 new conductors without previous railway experience, education, or leadership. But what they had in common was that they were white. And this next archive demonstrates a little bit how the railway companies perceived not necessarily the variety of their employees, but perceived what the employees that achieved a high standing in the company would look like. So this extract is coming from an article that was recurrent in the Spanner. It's personnel highlight. And as you can see, these people all have white trains. However, the issue was quickly taken up in Ontario by Stanley Grizzle, a porter and member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, sorry. Grizzle fought for all Black Canadians so they could exercise their right under Canadian law to be able to apply for their job, the job that they wanted without fear of discrimination. And according to Cecil Foster, the Canadian Pacific Railway fought the complaints, but ultimately the porters won. So they could be hired as sleeping car conductors. And in the documentary The Road Taken, there's Porter Lee Williams from Winnipeg that raised that question of the job discrimination. And in 1955, he asked the Brotherhood to remove job discrimination from the collective agreement. And because of Williams' hard work, many porters were able to become sleeping car conductors or to apply for higher jobs. So now moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about the exoticization of the Caribbean and more largely Caribbean people. Because as we just saw, and as I demonstrated, there is a very rigid perception of the porters within the periodicals and the pictures, right? So it's someone that's going to be achieving their duty, and everything that's related to their struggles and their fight is not showcased at all in the periodicals or in the images. However, there is a very large representation of the Black communities from the Caribbean in the periodicals that I consulted. So in her book, Dominion Over Palm and Pine, A History of Canadian Aspirations in the British Caribbean, historian Paula Hastings explores the history of unionism in the broader context of asymmetrical relationships between Canada and the British Caribbean. She notes that tropical and temperate regions were subjected to a particular design of exploitation and conquest. And in my opinion, the CNR and the CPR, through the periodicals, kind of embody these means of exploitation and conquest through really repetitive ads in their periodicals that are inciting customers to visit the Caribbean and the West Indies. And the recurrent publicities are portraying the Caribbean and its population like, again, very exotic, heavenly islands where Canadians, can rest, can be introduced to a totally different culture. But there's also a very strong discourse about freedom and mobility, right? And this is really interesting because when I was talking earlier about freedom and mobility, for the porters, mobility is a form of restriction. And here, of course, it's not necessarily, it's not, the population from the West Indies and the Caribbean that are mobile, but mobility here is really, really used as a mean of attracting white customers to freedom. And it's really, it was extremely recurrent. So here, another example of, the White Empress cruises, for example, where these ads are going to underline the global character of the cruises and mentioning that the boats visit more than 60 ports from all around the world, and especially in what is considered as the global South. The CPR really and the CNR really made it appealing for their customers to go overseas. And one thing that is interesting also is that no one is excluded in the articles about the Caribbean islands. So there are women, men, and children that can be found in the picture, resuming their everyday activities. And this is a very interesting contrast because there were barely any women in the images that I presented you, other than the white woman that was presented in the personal highlight archive. And this is the other thing that I want to talk about, which is Black women in the railway companies. So not a lot of Black women were featured in the CNR and the CPR periodicals. When they are, the pictures are blurry and the descriptions are either very brief or incomplete, but they're still here. So there's this lack of identification, but their presence can still be noted. So there's a good example here. So again, an article about a porter retiring with his wife on hand to help him down from his last run. We don't know much about this lady other than she's his wife. If I think about what I've been hearing in some of the oral interviews, she looks very happy. She might be proud of her husband. She's maybe happy that he's finally, coming home after being on the road for so long. We don't know, but we know that she's here and that she's supporting him, right? And she's being featured. Another example of this visibility and visibility again is that article, which is a presentation to a popular cook. And you can see in the back here, but again, very hard to, you know, identify. This is a Black woman, she's a cook. And there were some archives that I consulted that featured cooks, but this is the first one that I saw with a Black woman. And even then, the focus is not on, well, on the cooks in the background. It's on this one that's being, you know, rewarded, I think, for his retirement. There's only one article that I consulted that featured more than one Black woman, and it was published in 1952 by the Canadian National Railways magazine. So the article is about this lady here, Minnie L. Day. She's a seamstress for the CNR, and she's retiring after more than 34 years of service with her department. She's receiving a cake from her superiors. She's also portrayed with multiple employees, other Black women, Black men. Who are they? You know, family members, colleagues. This article really piqued my interest, considering that women are rarely featured within the CPR and the CNR periodicals. And after doing external research, I unfortunately did not find any relevant information on Black females employees within the railway companies. However, consulting the autobiography of Grizzle, I was able to find the existence of the Ladies Auxiliary. So the Ladies Auxiliary, briefly, is composed of porters' wives, daughters, sweethearts, and friends. And it's an organization that was concomitant with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, local chapters in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Calgary, and Vancouver. So they were active in a variety of sectors. So they raised money to pay for initiatives such as scholarship programs, and they were also involved in the Workers' Education Fund. So because of the Ladies Auxiliary, women had a better understanding of the Black porter's life. And according to Stanley Grizzle, they made a significant contribution in their communities. So thinking about the role of Black women within the CNR and the CPR is really not an impossible endeavor. So as we can, you know, see, they are involved and present within the community, within the companies as workers, but also in their own communities. So my concluding remarks on that. So I initially wanted to work on the experiences of Black railroad workers and Black porters in Canada. After completing my research, and even completing is a big word because as you can see, there's so much, again, that I could talk about. And the articles that I pick only represent like a tiny amount of everything that I actually, you know, collected. I gathered that there's definitely this doubled, you know, narrative within the archives. So you have the image of a porter that is docile, kind, and kind of like at the mercy of the white customers as employees. But when you look, at the oral histories, at the documentaries, autobiography, even monographs, you see that there's much more to say about that. You know, there's a whole different stories about their involvement with their communities and with their families and in their unions. And then you have, you know, this representation and very, you know, even confusing about the Caribbean and then the West Indies, where the exoticization really reveals the imperial means of the railway companies. But also there could be, you know, reflection around climatic determinism and even the impact, you know, of slavery and the representations linked to slavery in the way that the CNR and the CPR are thinking about Black workers or Black communities. So I hope that I was able to kind of like share a little bit of everything that has been going on in my mind since. And I do think that there is a lot more to decipher about, you know, these counter narrative and a lot of reflection to have about why these counter narratives, narratives in Ingenium's archives are the ones that are being presented. So that's it for me. And I just want to say that if some people want to share some questions in French, I'm also fluent in French. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so incredible to see all the different sources that you're pulling together to write this. I really appreciated it when I started at Ingenium. Black Porters was my first subject area, so I've always really loved your project, and to see where you went with sort of the collection materials is really lovely. I see that we have I have a question myself, but I'll put myself aside and I'll ask the question that's in the chat. First, Sarah asks, having worked with the archival material at Ingenium, what do you see as the roles of the National Collection and the community archives in preserving Black history in Canada? Big question, so I'll let you take your time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, if we think about national collections in general, the role of national collections should be to represent and preserve the stories of everyone that's in a specific territory, right? So national collections should invest time and should develop an expertise to reach out to communities and try to, create a dialogue. However, it's difficult, and I'm not quite sure. This is a conversation that we colleagues and I, friends, have been having for so long, but we are not really sure necessarily that these stories belong in national archives as well, right? Just because of not only the exploitation of archives, instrumentalization of these stories, but also there's just such a big lack of trust of our own communities to these archives and these institutions that have been invisibilizing our stories for so long. So I do think that there needs to be a dialogue, but I don't necessarily think that it is the responsibility of national collections and institutional archives to, have the material. I think that, national collections and institutional archives definitely have like the financial means to help support, communities and maybe like the development of their own archival material. But it's a very complex and big question. So yeah.
Definitely. There's lots of sort of push and pull, and we've had those conversations as well here. So your work really sort of highlighted that for me. And my question is maybe sort of coming more from like a public history lens as a graduate of Carleton's public history program, but you sort of pull on so many amazing archival materials, both from Ingenium's collection, but from elsewhere as well. I was wondering like if you could imagine, and I was also thinking about that picture of that Porter's exhibit. What other you've produced like a research document from your project, you'll produce an article for the Ingenium channel, but I was wondering like in your dream world, like what other sort of products of your research would you like to see exist?
Definitely an exhibition. Oh my, that would be I would be really excited to create an exhibition around that. I've been curating 2 exhibitions for Arambec in the past, and as you know, I'm pursuing a PhD, and there is really nothing that can compare to having, people see their own materials, see their own archives, or just having material that are picturing people that look like them and that are highlighting everything that they've been doing in museums, in universities and libraries. It's definitely very special, right? So I think that considering the amount of articles, because like I said, I think that I have like 500 of them. I took so many, pictures. There's so much to say. And it's very telling, right? Because I was talking about, again, the paradox of visibilization and invisibilization, but Black porters and Black workers were everywhere in the periodical. So there's definitely something to say about that. The CNR and the CPR could not hide their presence. So I think it would be really interesting to do an exhibition to kind of show, maybe I don't know, maybe like the evolution of the CNR and the CPR, but through the lens of a Black worker, or maybe retrace the trajectories of, Black porters, because I mentioned that they are mobile, going all around Canada. So maybe a map or something. Like you say, I just have like plenty of ideas, but I do think that there's a lot to do in terms of public history about that story, for sure.
Thank you so much. I also have lots of thoughts, of course, on that. I see a question from Emily in the chat. She says, I wonder if you could speak a bit more about the role of labor organizations and how they are represented in the 2 magazines you consulted.
Absolutely. So the labor organization, the main one that I found is the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, but it's really not because of the magazines, because there were absolutely no representation at all. I think at some point there was one picture, very vague, where you could see a group of porters and it said, oh, the porters are meeting to discuss their work. And I figured out that this was probably a labor organization, but other than that, no mention of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters at all. And definitely the role of labor organization, I'm not a labor historian, but I can talk a little bit about what I've been finding doing my research, is that the work of the labor organization was not only reserved to the workplace. So for example, Stanley Grisel was a very active member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters issued multiple letters to government officials, for example, to encourage kind of like the release and the relaxation. Yeah, I guess you can say it like that. That's maybe in French, but anyway, the immigration laws in around the 1950s, I think. It's 1952 that the immigration law started to kind of like being more open to Black people, but there's a lot of like lobbying, behind that by unions, that's for sure. And more broadly than that, there's also a lot of internal conflicts, like I said, with the Brotherhood, because at first the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was a white association. And even if it was led by African Americans in Canada, there was still white porters. So there was really also these conflicts happening within the union. So there's also that I could, share a little bit about. And I hope it answers the question. I mean, there's a lot that could be said, but definitely if you want to know more about labor, I would highly recommend Sage Mathieu or even Cecile Foster book. It was really a goldmine on that. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Lots of links in the chat for more things. But yeah, very, very telling. I agree with Emily that they do not mention the unions in the railway magazines and the periodicals. Makes sense from their perspective, I guess. Thank you so much, Samia, and thank you so much, Mila, for your incredible presentations. I think there's 1,001 conversations that can spin off just from what you were able to do in these 4 months. It's truly incredible. Thank you so much again. And I want to thank everyone here for attending. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat really quickly for our next series of lectures. And I'll also share my screen so everyone can see sort of what's coming next, which is very exciting. There we go. I think you're seeing it. I hope you are. You are seeing it? Okay, perfect. So our next lecture is going to be on November 13th. We have Dr. Cheryl Thompson joining us. It is going to be a hybrid session. So people in Ottawa, you can join us at Dominion Chalmers downtown, or for folks elsewhere, you can join us on Zoom. She's going to be presenting on her work called Race, Afrofuturism, and the Digital Divide, exploring the tenets of Black technoculture through art, dance, and literature, which is very exciting and intriguing. So you can use the QR code or the link that I sent in the chat to join and register for those. But yes, thank you everyone for coming. It was really lovely. I think you both did such a great job kickstarting the lecture series.
You're going to say who won the draw, Alexa?
Oh, me. Yes. Sorry. I think I've lost it in our conversations. Let me stop sharing my screen. Do you mind, Dominic, sending it to me again?
No, in a completely fair way, we drew the name of Trisha Turner. So we will send you, Trisha, a digital coupon to buy yourself a family pass for these 3 museums.
Perfect. Okay. Very exciting.
Good night, everyone.
Yes, thank you all.
Mackenzie, can you save the chat, please?
Oh, Dorothy Williams. Oh, wait, they're gone now, but she's here. Dr. Williams, did you have a question? I don't know if you raised your hand and I missed it.
Dorothy, did you want to say something? Oh, that was a...
Maybe not. Maybe it was an accidental hand
Okay,
raise.
so we'll say goodbye to Nancy and Charles and Dorothy.
Was wonderful. Thank you, Samia. Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you, Dorothy. It's nice that you're here.
Well, of course I was going to be here. I told you I was. It's great. Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it. We'll talk next time we see each other, Samia. Thank you very much.
Bye, see you soon.
Alexa, may I say something to Samia?
Oh, yes, Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah,
Nancy works at Ingenium.
I'm very glad I work for the foundation, but mon père a travaillé au CN toute sa vie. Puis, j'ai trouvé ça intéressant qu'est-ce que tu parlais parce que c'est vrai qu'on n'avait pas d'informations sur les personnes de race noire. Puis, je voyais des cuisiniers à l'époque, des années 70-80, c'est tout. Puis, parce qu'on prenait le train beaucoup, parce que je viens de Rimouski, puis on allait souvent à Montréal, Toronto, tout ça. Et puis, ma mère disait souvent, maudit, que le CN, c'est une compagnie de broche à foin.
Ah,
Parce que mon père avait eu un accident, puis il s'inquiétait plus du fait que le skidoo est-ce qu'il était endommagé au lieu de s'inquiéter que mon père était blessé.
merci du partage, là. C'est quand même drôle d'avoir ce type de commentaires-là à la fin. Fait que merci.
Oui, ma mère était contente de la pension plus tard, mais tu sais, comme.
Mais oui, absolument.
C'était tout.
Merci.
Mais merci, c'était très intéressant, les deux présentations.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Yeah, I think this concludes the evening. If everyone is good, thank you, Samia and Mila. You'll hear from me about all the other logistical things shortly, but I can let you all enjoy the rest of your evening. It was really great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
No problem.